In this video, we look at the character, the influences and the objectives of Vladimir Putin. There's nothing more important than understanding the people who are affecting your world and avoiding the trap we often make of allowing moral judgments to cloud our perceptions to the point where we mistake their intent and their likely next moves. This is not about excusing what they've done or indeed condemning what they've done. Understand first without preconception, then you can decide what to do with that insight. So, that said, let's take a look. One of the first things to note about Vladimir Putin is that having entered from an early stage into the KGB, the control of information has been a watchword for the public persona from the start. He has kept the facts and the stories about his life very tightly under wraps. Anything that claims to give an insight into his character, his early life, or how he thinks needs to be scrutinised extremely carefully, because such stories have been his own vehicle, and many of them are traceable directly back to him. For basic biography, he was born in what was then Leningrad in 1952, the only surviving child of his parents. His youthful pursuits included a heavy focus on training in judo. He studied law at Leningrad University, joining the KGB immediately on graduation in 1975. He was posted to Dresden in East Germany in 1985, just as Cold War tensions were about to start giving way to Gorbachev's reforms, being recalled to Leningrad in 1990, just as the USSR was about to collapse. He was moved to Moscow in 1996, and then there was a bewilderingly rapid ascent. In March 97, promoted to be Deputy Chief of the Presidential Staff, July 98, Head of the FSB, the successor to the KGB, August 99, named in rapid succession Deputy Prime Minister and then Prime Minister. And then not only that, but President Boris Yeltsin indicated that Putin was his preferred successor, and he was officially elected in March 2000. What was behind an astonishingly rapid rise? Who helped make it happen? There are various different versions told by people after the fact. There was almost nothing recorded at the time, but it was all happening. So we don't know. All you can do is look at what he said, what he's done, and who he has been influenced by. And to be very careful of all those stories that were carefully crafted to present him to the Russian public in the way that he wanted. So, for example, in his 2000 book, really his campaign document for his first election campaign, Od Pervoga Litsa, first person, he described how at the KGB Academy he had been identified as having, quote, a diminished sense of danger. That book is the only source of that claim, and it seems that the intention was to counter the impression that he was a bit dull or a predictable kind of a guy. Fiona Hill and Cliff Gaddy, in their highly regarded book on Putin, Operative in the Kremlin, which I draw heavily on for this video, described it like this. Putin wants people to see him in certain ways and yet be confused. He promotes the idea of himself both as a risk taker and also as someone who takes calculated risks and always has a fallback option. It is part of his play in the domestic and international political game to keep everyone guessing about, and in some cases fearing, how he might react. Hill and Gaddy said that, having studied his life closely, they had concluded that the point for Putin on information isn't whether something is true or not, but on how words and deeds are perceived by others. He also is enough of a PR expert to understand the value of letting people fill in some of the gaps for themselves. In biographical interviews, Putin has said that one of his main skills is to get the Russian people to see him as they want him to be, not necessarily what he really is. And he puts a lot of emphasis on this. He makes a show of listening seriously to the Russian people and has done so with various trips to different locations, taking a variety of forums of question and answer and discussion sessions. Most of the costumed stunts that he does have been motivated by creating empathy between himself and a targeted group. to feature them and give them respect in a public way. And you shouldn't underestimate the power of that, given that Putin has consistently polled as Russia's most popular politician over an extended period. Hill and Gaddy said that Putin is really understandable from 6 identities that really summarise key aspects of his beliefs and his character. They described these as the statist, the history man, the survivalist, the outsider, the free marketeer, and the case officer, the KGB case officer. So the statist, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Boris Yeltsin launched an ambitious shock therapy economic program involving the abolition of central planning, the privatization of industry, liberalization of prices and budget cuts. The shock part of that shock therapy was extremely severe. Inflation soared, unemployment soared, revolt was in the air, and it took the form of a confrontation between the president and parliament. Literally, Yeltsin abolished the parliament, called new elections, and ended up ordering Russian tanks to fire on the White House to force their surrender. In a 2012 interview with The Guardian, former Kremlin advisor Gleb Pavlovsky said that the incident had had a profound effect on Putin. From that point on, Putin's view was that the losers in a political confrontation would be put up against a wall and shot, literally. Putin always said, "We know ourselves. We know that as soon as we move aside, you will destroy us." In the 1996 election, Yeltsin found himself in serious trouble. He was in bad health, he was unpopular with approval ratings as low as 3%. The Kremlin was pretty much bust. So Yeltsin's team reached out to the business people who had benefited so handsomely from the government's reform process. They had amassed fortunes: media, banks, oil. In return for massive campaign support, Yeltsin promised the oligarchs privileged bidding positions for the most important state companies due to be privatised. It established the oligarchs as power brokers, at least for the time being. The public saw it as handing over the country's assets to criminals. At the same time, Yeltsin was trying to hold together the individual regions of the Russian Federation. An attempt was made to overthrow the rebellious Chechen government, which ended in humiliating failure. The point is that the overwhelming theme felt keenly by Putin was that Russia had gone from the proud head of the Soviet Empire when he was posted to Germany. By the time he had come back, it had collapsed into chaos, conflict, corruption, and humiliation. Russia was seen as a second-tier country by the West, and the Baltic states that had been annexed by the USSR refused to join Russia's CIS successor. They set their sights instead on joining the EU, and even worse from Russia's point of view, joining NATO. Putin first and foremost saw his early objective to rebuild the strength of the Russian state, to rescue it from its death spiral. And he laid this all out in a 5,000-word treatise on December the 29th, 1999, Putin's so-called Millennium Message. It was Putin's manifesto for the start of his first presidency. And he said this: "For Russians, a strong state is not an anomaly to fight against. Quite the contrary, it is the source and guarantor of order, the initiator and main driving force of any change." Putin promised first and foremost to be the rebuilder of the state, to be its servant and guide. But Hill and Gaddy note that the state isn't to be understood the same in Russia as it is in the liberal West. They said this: "In the United States, the state exists to protect the rights of the individual. The twist in Russia is that while Mother Russia must be protected, she does not necessarily protect her own citizens. In Russia, the state is primary. The state is a standalone entity. The individual and society are and must be subordinate to the state and its interests." Putin felt the collapse of the USSR very strongly. In his annual address to the nation in 2005, he famously declared the demise of the Soviet Union to be the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Now, that wasn't referring, as some suggested, to the communist system, but instead to the collapse of the Russian state itself as he saw it. His focus on the state also supports that second identity, the history man. Putin declares himself a student of history. He certainly uses Russian history to support his policy positions. It's from this history that he draws his conception of what is the distinctive character of Russia. Quoting Hill and Gaddy again, instead of autocracy, Putin settled upon sovereign democracy. Russia is accountable and answerable to no one, certainly no outside power, apart from the opinion of the majority of its population. Until 2014, when he spoke about the Russian people, he talked about the narod, the collective people of Russia, and he was careful to avoid the language of ethnic Russian nationalism. He talked about the diverse population of modern Russia, not the old Russia of the 1800s. One of Putin's favourite quotes, often given in response to people who believed that Russia needed another revolution in ideas, was this: "We do not need great upheavals. We need a great Russia." A statement that was paraphrased from Pyotr Stolypin, Prime Minister under Nicholas II, a person that Putin's government promoted as a great historical figure epitomising the Russian spirit. Stolypin also famously said, "Give the state 20 years of internal and external peace and you will not recognise Russia." And that was a quote that Putin adopted as well as he took over from the chaos and destruction of the post-Soviet Yeltsin years. Only in his case it was, "Give me 20 years and you will not recognise Russia." Another key aspect of his experience and personality was that of Putin, the survivalist. His family had history of surviving against the odds. During the war, the family had to endure the blockade of Leningrad by Hitler, which lasted from September 1941 to January 1944. They had to escape artillery barrages, bombing, starvation and disease, challenges that took an estimated 1.5 million people, which included the Putin's 5-year-old son, who was Vladimir's older brother. Born soon after those events, Putin would slip very easily back towards the view that Russians were by nature survivalists. They were people who constantly think of and prepare for the worst. And Putin learned some of the lessons himself the hard way. In 1991, for instance, when he was on the Leningrad City Council. The economic crisis was huge. Leningrad was falling short of basic foodstuffs. And to cut a long story short, Putin made some deals with companies to import meat and potatoes to Leningrad, acting beyond his powers, cutting across those who should have been doing it. And the deal went wrong. The money was paid, but the goods went to Moscow instead. Putin found himself in hot water. He was only bailed out of it by a well-placed supporter at the time. The episode taught Putin 2 lessons that would go on to influence his governing philosophy. One, during difficult events, Russia's guarantee of survival came from its natural resources. They should always be kept in strategic reserve. 2, he decided private companies could not be trusted. Consequently, the state always had to reserve the power to exercise a degree of control over them. And you could see these in action once he became president. He started creating strategic state reserves to deal with a range of contingencies and focused on replenishing stores that had been pilfered and drained in the final years of the USSR. He highly prioritised Russia paying off all outstanding foreign debts. It was not a sovereign power, in his conception, unless it was free of obligation to anyone. By doing that and rebuilding strategic reserves, he reduced Russia's exposure to the volatility of the global economy. Yeltsin's Russia had been dependent on the IMF, heavily in debt, and had been forced to acquiesce in a number of foreign policy areas as a result, a fact that Putin felt to be humiliating. When Putin took over, the foreign reserves were down to $8.5 billion and the external debt of the country was $133 billion. 8 years later, that debt was down to $37 billion and the foreign exchange reserves had grown to over $600 billion. Russia had one of the lowest debt to GDP ratios in the world, and that made the country more resilient by far. So the Asian financial crisis of 1997 had forced Russia to default on its debt and devalue the ruble. But by the time the 2008 global financial crisis came along, Russia was hit hard for sure, but it was able to absorb the blows and ride the crisis out. For the survivalist Putin, strategy was about contingency planning. Another aspect of Putin's personalities is that of the outsider. This is something he's spent a lot of time cultivating. His public image is that of a person who stands outside politics and above the fray. The lone figure at the top, entirely focused on the work of serving the people. Not one of those privileged elite. Someone who came in, instead, without ideological baggage, to get things done. One of us, not one of them. It served him well in his first 2 terms as president. The attempt to maintain it was expressed through regular public dressings down of his subordinates, helpless bureaucrats or greedy oligarchs on TV and in public. Particularly when there was public discontent over some issue or another, he would be there, showing that he's in charge but not to blame. Then there was the free marketeer. Crucial to his early success in stabilising Russia was his conviction in support of the relatively free market. Putin had seen for himself, from his placement in East Germany as the system was beginning its decline, how stark a contrast there had been at that point between East and West. He didn't get the sort of starry-eyed optimism about entrepreneurialism that Americans have. His early experience in St. Petersburg was more cynical than that, seeing how the oligarchs bailed out Yeltsin in return for massive advantages. His view was that the winners in the market were those who could best exploit others' vulnerabilities. In the short term, that was enough. Across the first decade of Putin's rule, Russia showed one of the most dramatic turnarounds in modern economic history. But in the same way that we know presidents of all countries take credit wherever they can for things they didn't necessarily entirely control, it's true to say the main driver of performance was oil price increases. The economy was heavily based on Russia's plentiful natural resources, and higher oil prices meant boom times, almost regardless of what you did. Almost. It was not a sign that Russia's business sector was innovating and modernising in the way that would have made its success sustainable. But to be fair, it would have been easy for a country's political rulers to squander such wealth, and plenty did. But Putin, the survivalist, did not. He likewise resisted those who would have easily fallen back to old communist habits. In the acute phase of the 2008-2009 world financial crisis, some of the leading oligarchs asked Putin to renationalise their businesses, and he refused, telling them at a subsequent meeting, "This is a fundamental choice of the government. We don't want to create a system of state capitalism, we want to create a system of socially oriented market economy." The other key element of his success in the first 10 years was he managed to do what Yeltsin could not: create a system that actually successfully collected the taxes that were due. For years there had been widespread tax evasion by citizens and most importantly by businesses. Putin used intimidation and force, including sending armed operatives to the head offices of major corporations. With all that direction of travel, even if Russia is a much smaller economy than that of America, it was easy for Putin to see it as a healthily rising power, even as America was a declining one. The West saw post-Soviet Russia as a second-rate power, but for Putin, the USSR had been a mighty empire. It collapsed because of its mistakes, but Russia the Great could rise again, guided by the right hands. And the final aspect of the Putin personalities that more than anything guided the style of governance was the case-handling style of the KGB. Early in his career, Putin learned that in a system where corruption is endemic, you could always gather incriminating evidence against people which could be used as leverage when you needed it. Add to that the routine use of force and intimidation, the casual but always strategic ease with lying and sowing confusion and doubt. These were well-honed techniques in the sort of work that the KGB excelled at, and they became Putin's hallmark as head of state. So those were the 6 building blocks. But historical figures get defined by how they respond to the big events or create big events. It's worth noting 2 pivotal points in the second half of Putin's reign. The protests of 2012, when he was coming back as president having spent 4 years as prime minister, was one of them. And the other was, of course, the move to annex Crimea, which one could see as the first shot of the current war. Late 2011-2012, as Putin was coming back, protests broke out. A lot of voters thought the election had been rigged. Various people on social media were circulating blatant individual examples of vote tampering, and it gained something of a head of steam. But really, after 12 years, people were just tired of brand Putin, and particularly in Moscow, where the urban population voted against him in large numbers. Now, Putin had seen the collapse of the Soviet Union in the past. He was clear that this had to be dealt with strongly, and particularly because of the potential contagion from elsewhere. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine was in his mind, as was the then upheavals in the Arab world, the so-called Arab Spring. Remember Putin's expectations upon regime change. Once you've been ousted, you are killed. He gave his critics the offer to come back into the fold, to express their criticism in a constructive, mannered way. Once that opportunity had been offered, he then set about crushing the ones that didn't take it up, and he did so by singling out certain high-profile groups to punish. So Alexei Navalny, who was then an anti-corruption blogger, was arrested and put on trial. Members of a female punk rock band, Pussy Riot, staged a protest at Moscow's cathedral. They were arrested, subjected to show trials. 2 of the young women were sentenced to hard labour in penal colonies, and others followed. By the end of 2013, the movement had been effectively squashed. Putin's overall conclusion from what he saw of those protests was that the intelligentsia had been acting as a 5th column for the West. And this cemented his belief that had been growing over the period of his interactions with George W. Bush and Barack Obama. He'd seen NATO expanding against Russia's wishes. The West had encouraged protests designed to bring him down. And this fed into the events that followed. So the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2004-2005, and then the subsequent events in Ukraine in 2013-2014. These were the result, he believed, of the West's attempts to drag Ukraine away from the Russian orbit. And so began a real tragedy of the last decade, the astonishingly major misunderstandings between Russia and the West. The West believed that post-Cold War, we lived in a benign, unipolar world, with the United States as the setter, by common consent, of the rules of the road. It celebrated democracy as the inevitable endpoint of the journey that everybody was on. It presumed that China and Russia did not see the US as threatening them in any way, because everyone understood this was a rules-based system, not an old empire-building, power-based one. Putin's perceptions of the time since the collapse of the Soviet Union was, however, starkly different. In his speech celebrating the annexation of Crimea in 2014, Putin said that NATO was a military alliance. It could invade, not just defend. Indeed, he said NATO went to war in 1999 in Yugoslavia, with its warplanes bombing Belgrade. What the West believed to be a response to Yugoslav atrocities in Kosovo, Putin and his colleagues in Russia saw as NATO attacking another country with no authority from the United Nations, with the US firmly in charge. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, on what Putin said was clearly spurious grounds, made matters even worse. And he said this about America: they believe in their exceptionalism and exclusivity, in the fact that they are permitted to decide the fate of the world, that only they can ever be right. In 2013, Edward Snowden blew the whistle on America's NSA surveillance overreach, and it had rather confirmed Putin in his view. So, no, he said, Russia had not accepted the rules laid down by the US. It had endured a series of humiliations when it was too weak to do otherwise. But with the annexation of Crimea, Russia was announcing that it was back, a sovereign nation again, whose position on events had to be respected. It would still cooperate with the West, but only on its own terms. And it would be Russia in ascendance, not in retreat. The US still had no conception that it was being seen as a threat, and as a result it made a series of policy decisions totally unaware of how radically they were being misinterpreted in Moscow. In response, Russia chipped away at the West, acting as the disruptor. Putin passed laws at home to crack down on that fifth column of Western influence, the likes of NGOs and others who were promoting democracy and human rights. And he set out to make common cause with Europe's conservatives and populists, calling on resistance to the West's rejection of traditional values. Putin the anti-woke, his own fifth column in the West. But ultimately, the fault line was always Ukraine. When Putin watched the protests in Kyiv's Maidan Square, he noted that Western leaders were anything but neutral on those protests, with several foreign ministers and senior US officials appearing in Ukraine to express their solidarity with the protesters. For him, this was confirmation that the West was manipulating Ukraine to push it away from Putin's desired Eurasian Union, to pull it instead into the EU. When the interim Ukrainian government briefly repealed the status of Russian as an official second language, it gave Putin the opening to turn to that weapon he'd previously avoided, Russian nationalist sentiment, to start to drive a wedge between Russians and Ukrainians. After the annexation of Crimea, it was a tool he tried to put back in its box. But it's one of those things, once unleashed, is rather hard to control. He had the vision that, having asserted its power and its localised interests, Russia would now go back to focusing on its domestic concerns, and the outside world would leave it alone and keep out of its area of intended influence. But post-Crimea, Ukraine was awash with anti-Russian sentiment, and this solidified the intent to do exactly the things that Putin most feared. The rest, of course, we know only too well. And you should be able to imagine right now how President Biden's recent off-the-cuff call for regime change will have been received. Everyone else thought Biden was speaking dangerously off script and out of turn. Putin will simply have presumed that he said the quiet part out loud, because it was totally congruent with what he has long believed. In their book, Hill and Gaddy conclude that Putin is not to be underestimated. He will fight to the end and be ruthless to get what he wants. And they said people in the West misunderstand his skill as a strategist. But they also add that we also fail to appreciate just how little Putin really understands us, our motives and our values. Such an understanding gap doesn't absolve anyone from the consequences of their actions. But if we think that the way out of the current war crisis is going to be some sort of negotiated settlement, it's time we understood better who we're dealing with.